AQUABIZ, all the best knowledge for aquatic system.
All right, let's get started. So completely different, I guess we're related, talking about feed ingredients. It's something I work quite a lot on. I collaborate to a lot of research on this, and I also keep my eyes on a lot of new technologies and a lot of issues. So I wanted to share some insights that I developed recently about new tests, new ideas, new technology to do quality control of feed ingredient. Many of you are involved in this process, right? It's a very important part of feed manufacturing, the quality control of the ingredient, not just about right formulation. You need to know what the quality of the ingredient is in order to make good feed, in order to make feed of consistent quality. Right? You don't want to make a feed that is good one week and then bad the other week because of variation of the batch. So measuring the quality of the ingredient, ensure understanding what you have, is very important to making cost-effective feed of consistent quality. Now, there's evidence, if you work in a feed mill, it's evident that the quality, the composition, but also many other quality aspects, whether physical characteristics, right, the level of dust, of fines, etc., the level of contaminant in there is highly variable from batch to batch of feed ingredient. So it's really important to have the tools in order to be able to monitor changes or variation in the quality of the ingredient. I interact with a lot of feed manufacturers all over the region, all over the world, and I see the quality control techniques that are used, and I find that many of those techniques have significant limitations. Everybody's using proximate analyses, and proximate analysis is very practical, but you're not really measuring real nutrients. You're measuring properties of nutrients or components of nutrients like nitrogen, and it's not really a measure of the real nutritional value of ingredient. Most feed manufacturers now are using NIRS, very practical again, but the value of what you're getting, the measurements you're getting, is a function of the quality of the calibration that you have and the variation of the material that you're analyzing. So you may have the right calibration, but your material, as it changes a little bit, this calibration may not be fit to that material. And it's not a direct measure of nutritional value. You're simply shining light on a sample. It's reflecting the light. The bonds within the molecules are reflecting that light. And you say, you do a calculation, I think there's this level of nutrients, but it's not a direct measurement of the nutrients. So we have to do this. And it's not a measurement of how available these nutrients are to the animal, unless you have the very specific calibration. So I think we should be investing more effort in developing better tests, better technologies in order to characterize the quality of ingredient, and I'll show you on this. Some of the things, so what is used right now is, like I mentioned, proximate analyses, moisture, crude protein, crude lipids, and the like. I think many feed manufacturers use pepsin HCl digestibility assay, degradability assay. I'll talk about this. You'll use ELISA-based tests and other tests like this to screen for mycotoxins and other compounds like this. Right, very quickly to screen. There's a number of technology available, so I think pretty many manufacturers are using this. And then you're doing basic grain quality testing the starch level, the starch cooking, the gluten or something, but it's very basic analyses, relying a lot on NIRS for proximate, and sometimes, quite often, amino acids or fatty acids and predicting it. For other nutrients, not that good, like minerals and the like is not that good, but there's there. And then if you need more information, you generally send your sample out to a lab, an external lab that will do the analysis for you. You cannot do this for every batch. You do this once in a while, right? Once in a blue moon. And then how frequently you use, basically how frequently your suppliers is offering you to do it. I've interacted a lot with Evonik in the past, for example. They used to do a lot of amino acid analyses for feed manufacturer and for me in my research. And now they've curtailed down, right, that services a lot. DSM and other Adiseo and other input suppliers are providing that kind of services, certain types of services, but I'm finding they're restricting this, right? So what do? Right? You have to find private lab that can do it for you. How often do you do it, right? So you need some alternative, I believe. I think there's interesting things that you can do. So I'll focus on some indicator. Methods to assess whether the results you're getting from a lab in terms of amino acid analyses make sense or not. In vitro and in vivo and in vitro digestibility assay. Chemical indicators of heat damage. My research group is one of the only one in the world that works on this. I'll show you some of our work. Disulfide bonds and disulfide bridge related to this. Lipid quality indicator or origin and adulteration indication. Indicators of grain quality, and then rapid mineral analysis. So I'll try to cover all of those, right? In terms of novel technology, novel kind of equipment, we say, well, pH stat titrator, I think is a pretty interesting technology for some of you to adopt. Raman spectroscopic analyzer, I think, are becoming more affordable and portable and affordable. Before that, it was a big, huge machine that needed liquid nitrogen and gas and all kinds of things that would cost millions of dollars. Now there's an analyzer that are worth $50,000, $100,000 a piece, and they can do some very interesting things as I'll show you. And then XRF for mineral analyses, which is emerging as the technology is becoming more affordable and used, right? My goal is not to explain the technology and how they work. It's just to show you example of successful application of the technology, right, from a feed manufacturing perspective. So the first topic I want to talk about is amino acid composition, because I work on amino acid nutrition of fish, and my lab analyzes amino acids, and we send a lot of samples out for analyses, and you go crazy when you see your results sometime, because you can send, we used to say you send the sample to 3 different labs, you get 3 completely different answers in terms of amino acids. So which one is true? So we've developed over the years some tricks to determine whether the results make sense or not, whether we're getting garbage results or we're getting valuable results. Pretty important. Now you can get a result, right, from a NIRS machine or an amino acid analysis, right? Never believe those results at face value, right? There's always some number of problem with these values. So it's not because a machine will tell you, oh, lysine is 1.72, that is really 1.72% lysine in your sample. Always maintain a certain degree of skepticism. Now there's a lot of variation in amino acid composition of common protein source. This is a survey done, sponsored by USEC and Evonik, or with data from NIRS analysis of many batch of soybean, and look at how variable the level of amino acids are, even for, let's say, 46 or 47% soybean meal. It's highly variable in terms of threonine, lysine, methionine, cysteine, etc. So you buy soybean, you buy a 46 or 47% protein soybean, where you're getting different amount of amino acids. So knowing the amount of amino acids is very important, because the animal doesn't use protein, it uses amino acid. So you need that critical piece of information. However, I can tell you, when I see this level of variation, how can a soybean protein be so variable, right? Yes, there's soil, there's seasons and harvesting, and I still maintain a little bit of degree of skepticism at whether this variation is truly that big, or it may be associated with a variability machine. You're not measuring amino acids, you're measuring light reflected by NIRS there. So I'm always a little skeptical about these values showing, oh, there's huge variation. Is this huge variation really true, or just an artifact of the technique that you're using? And why I'm saying this is, even if you have lab analyses, like individual amino acid analyses results, you will see variation, because amino acid analysis is a compromise. My old boss Young Cho used to say, amino acid analysis is a 1700 technique, right? You use acid hydrolysis, the same as Lavoisier and his predecessor were using in their lab in France, right, in Britain in the 1700, 1800, right? And then you're passing these hydrolysate to a 20th century machine and even 21st century machine, right? Machine that have developed this, right? So you kind of a disconnect. And the hydrolysis step is very important. There's a very good paper by Paul Moore, and I think I mentioned it in the previous seminars. Some of you participated too. We adopt 24 hours, so the conventions use 24 hours hydrolysis. But for some protein, you need to use 48 hours. You should be using 48 hours. In some protein, for some amino acid, 24 hours is too long, and you destroy these amino acids. So that 24 hour is a compromise between hydrolyzing the protein enough so you can recover the individual amino acids, but not being too long so the sensitive amino acids don't get destroyed. And you can see, I'll show you an example that actually the hydrolysis time can play a role. Now, how do we judge the value of amino acid analyses? Well, we measure the crude protein. We know we can measure nitrogen very well. We can measure protein quite well, estimate protein quite well using Keldal or Dumas method. And then we analyze amino acid and we sum up the amino acids and we do a recovery. And this is real results from a recent research project that I collaborated to in Vietnam. Let's say our recovery was 78, so it was low, right? So 78, 63, so we say, well, your amino acids are probably not right, they're too low. So that's the first quality control test you can do. Sum up your amino acids and determine whether it's close to your crude protein or not, right? However, this is not, right, yeah. You can actually, right, so in this case, there was poor recovery, so say, well, there's some problem with them. And I was reading that paper by Paul Moore and says, what if we change this? And those actually were feces. Well, in feces, the protein makeup is different, right? What isn't end up in the feces is stuff that is a little bit more difficult to hydrolyze by the enzyme. So maybe there's going to be more resistance also to the acid hydrolysis. So the technician in the lab did a 48 hours analysis, and sure enough, we increased our recovery of amino acid by 2 percentage points, by about, right, 10, 15, maybe 15%, or even close to 20% better recovery of that by simply increasing. Now, longer hydrolysis would break down more amino acids, right, of the sensitive amino acids, and we got better recovery. So really, the real number is likely higher than 13%. So this is the end result, right, after hydrolyzing for 2 days, but we know some amino acid gets destroyed. So the real amino acid content of our feces or feed ingredient is probably higher than this because we have destruction. So you can see, right, so that number 13, don't pin your hat on it. It's not all that true. Now, one thing that we do is when we sum up this recovery, we're doing wrong, because when we hydrolyze amino acids, we hydrolyze a protein into individual amino acid. The amino acid gain weight. They gain an OH. They gain almost a water molecule except one hydrogen. So the mass, let's say, of arginine within protein is weighing 156. Arginine, when you hydrolyze it, is weighing 174. You have a 7 or 8% increase in the weight of arginine when you have an hydrolysate versus the protein. So you take a protein, you got 50 grams of protein, you hydrolyze it, you end up really with 54 grams of protein in the end when you have that. So you have to take this. So when you're doing that sum I showed you there, you're actually overestimating. It's not 63% recovery, it's probably 58% recovery in this case, right? So you have to use smarter approach, or you have to take this into account. So it's really bad. So that's what we did in my lab. We did a research project. Many people were involved in this, and we still didn't publish a paper, but we're still using it almost on a weekly basis to audit the quality. We know we can analyze nitrogen very well, right? Keldal technique or Dumas techniques are really quite accurate. So if we measure 11.1% nitrogen in the fish meal, we know that there's about 11.1, 11.2, 11.3, or 11, whatever, but somewhere in that water, right? Now we analyze amino acid, and rather than summing up the sum of the weight of amino acids, because they gain weight when you hydrolyze them, we count the nitrogen atom, the mass of nitrogen that is contained within our sample that was associated with this essential amino acid, non-essential amino acid, non-protein nitrogen, things like nucleic acids and volatile nitrogen, and etc. Now, one thing we realize, and when we do this, a lot of nitrogen is missing. Typically, even though we use the best amino acid technique, we use a UPLC with the AQUATAG technique, which is really reliable, validated by Evonik, by many different labs. Everybody's using the same technique, and it seems to be reliable or repeatable at least, we're missing about 10 to 20% of the nitrogen, right? So I'm buying a soybean meal at 46% soy or protein, right? Really, what I'm finding is 40% protein. Where's that 6%? I paid for it. I shipped, right, from US to here. I paid for that protein to be shipped here. It was on my bill. I'm analyzing it. I'm finding the nitrogen, but I'm not finding the amino acid, right? So actually, something is wrong. Something is missing. I discuss this issue with people at Evonik, they're chemists in there, and I say, oh, I don't think there's any problem. We're all getting the same answer. Yeah, if you're all using the same technique, the same equipment, of course you're going to get the same answer, but that doesn't mean the answer is right. We have to go a little bit further. So where is that protein missing? What is that nitrogen, right? That nitrogen is there. We know it's there, but it's not present in amino acids. So what is it? It's either our amino acid analyses are not accurate, so the amino acids are there, we're not seeing them. They get destroyed when we analyze them, or they don't get hydrolyzed from the protein, right, when we hydrolyze them. Or there's something else there. There's something that we're not measuring. There's other compound. Well, you say, well, you measure non-protein nitrogen. Well, go measure non-protein nitrogen, right? There's a million different kinds of molecules that contain nitrogen, and it's not amino acids or protein. So, right, what do you analyze? How do you analyze those? It's very complicated to analyze. So there may be some other molecule there that contains nitrogen that we don't measure as non-protein nitrogen, right? And that's the whole question. And I think it's a very urgent question. Just think about it. You buy soybean meal, right? 46% soybean meal. You're only finding 40. That's for every ton is 60 kilograms of protein. It's just vanished like this, right? I paid for it. Well, just do the math in your head. Like 60 kilograms of protein is a lot. Or, right, if that protein is there and you don't account for it, that's one thing. If that protein is not there, right, you're basically being sold something that is not valuable. So you have to also know about it and then be able to screen ingredient for that. So that simple mass balance equation is very helpful to audit the results from lab, but also, right, figure out which ingredients is causing me problem, which ingredients, right, is containing those compounds that don't seem to be analyzed and could be a problem. So you see, it could be using two protein source with the same protein level, but one could be good and the other one could be worthless, or not worthless, but much less value because it doesn't contain amino acids. So simple calculation like this, right, costs nothing, and this. We hope to make this available into our platform, so code it into code so you can enter your amino acid results in our platform and do this. So if you're interested in this, we can talk about it. Now say having amino acids is a good thing, but what's most important is that these amino acids are digestible, because if it's not digestible, it's not usable by the animal. So definitely, right, measuring digestibility of amino acids or the digestible amino acid content of your ingredient is central. Right? You can have high level amino acids. If those are not digestible, it's of no value. Well, I can tell you for a fact that measuring digestibility looks like simple. I collect poop and I analyze, right, feces and you get the answer. Well, I review a lot of effort. I'm called to review papers. I review scientific effort. I review industrial digestibility trial. And in 90% of the case, I find significant error. So anytime I see a digestibility result, now I don't believe the result until I see the raw data and I audit the raw data, and I can tell you in 90%, and I'm not lying. I did 2 trials, helped a company in Chile do 2 trials with salmon. They invest probably $200,000 US dollar in the effort, and the results were worthless. Zero, absolutely none. They just wasted $200,000. Company sent sample to Norway to a lab, very well-known lab, to study phosphorus digestibility. The results come back, significant error. Even the best lab, they pay 70,000 euro for that trial. The results contain error, and I can tell you story and a story after story of this. So never believe digestibility results until you audit the value out there. However, right? Maybe I will brag. Maybe chauvinistic a little bit, you can do good work. And if you're like really mental, really like focused, and then auditing the results and making sure this, and that's what I do in Vietnam with a team in Vietnam. We measured the digestibility, and I showed it in a number of presentations in recent year. We measured the digestibility of US soy, Brazilian soy, and Argentinian soy, and I trust those results because I've done it myself. I checked the result and I validated those with animal trials. And you can see we found US soy was 91, the protein was 91% digestible. Argentinian was 88 and Brazilian was 85% digestible. Determined that there's variation in the digestibility ingredient. That's key information that you need to feed into your feed formulation program and demonstrate, right, the value of soy. The other interesting piece of information is that the other ingredients that we use in our diet were actually really quite poorly digestible. So if you're changing your ingredients and say, I don't want to use imported ingredient, I want to use local ingredient, also know the digestibility of your local ingredients and invest in this characterization because, right, protein is not protein. There's different digestibility out there and you can do good work. Now, when you do digestibility and you look at digestibility results as a quality control, as a way to characterize ingredient, always put the emphasis of having a verification whether these amino acids, these digestibility makes sense, and they really represent the bioavailability of amino acid. So that's why I personally always carry out digestibility trial and growth trial in parallel with the same diet and with a specific experimental design. And in this specific case, right, we saw that US soy was more digestible than Brazilian and Argentina. And when we look at the growth rate and the FCR, or the Fe deficiency, the reciprocal, right, we showed that that difference was translated in the efficiency of the animal and in the growth of the animal, right? You can have different digestibility, but it may not make any difference. You may have the same digestibility, but different level of bioavailability. So you always need to verify with the growth of the animal, the protein deposition of the animal to see whether the amino acids were bioavailable. So not just relying on digestibility. We recently completed a trial in Vietnam with tilapia on meat and bone meal digestibility, getting 2 US meat and bone meal and a European meat and bone meal. And we did the trial very carefully again with meat and bone meal, and we found significant variation. The same kind of variation we saw with soybean meal, we see in meat and bone meal and more. We saw a meat and bone meal of 80% digestibility, and we saw another one with 91% digestibility, right? So you buy meat and bone meal, 11 percentage point difference. You buy a 50% meat and bone meal, right? One contains, right, 400 kilograms of digestible protein. The other one contains 450 kilograms of digestible protein in it, right? So really important difference, very important cost consideration. We backed this up with feeding trial, and we also found that these differences in digestibility were reflected in the protein deposition of the animal, so these values are reliable. So you see, you need to characterize your ingredients. You can just assume a certain digestibility for soy. You cannot just assume a certain digestibility for meat and bone meal, and we've done the work with DGGS, and the same thing, there is variation in the digestibility of the ingredient of the same origin. So you cannot just use one table value for one ingredient. You really need to go down and drill down and know this and invest the effort to measure the digestibility. Okay. We also measure the digestibility of amino acids, and more tricky because of the issue of amino acid analyses, compounding. So you got the error of the digestibility trial plus the error of the amino acid analysis. I'm always skeptical about amino acid digestibility results, but they seem to add up. When we line up the digestibility of amino acids level, digestible amino acid level of the feed, and the performance of the animal, it seems to make sense. And you can see that different amino acids have different digestibility, and of course different digestibility of protein will translate into different digestibility of amino acid. The protein is made up of amino acid, so when you look at results, if the digestibility of amino acid doesn't correspond or moves in the same direction as the digestibility of protein, you got a problem, right? It has to be consistent. So that's low kind of quality control, data auditing, right? Verification that you can use to see whether results are making sense or not. So it's like, so simple things that you can do, simple calculation, simple trick like this can help you judge the quality of the results that you're getting and the quality, and then better use this in your feed formulation. Now, digestibility assays are a pain in the butt, right? Actually takes a long time, very expensive. Very few places can do this well, can do it in a timely fashion. You cannot screen different batch of the ingredients that you're getting in a meal. Impossible to do. You can only do maybe once in a while, once every few years, right? But do invest some effort in this. But then you need a surrogate. You need a test in order that helps you predict the digestibility. Well, most, right, people will use pepsin HCl degradability or digestibility assay. It's a great technique, very simple. You mix your sample in a buffer with enzymes and HCl. You shake it, right? Shake it all about, and then you filter it. And what goes to the filter paper, you say was digestible. But it's not really digestible. It's degradable. It got down to polypeptide that could cross that filter paper, but you did not go down to the individual amino acid level. You went down to polypeptide level. So you're not at the level where the animal is absorbing the individual amino acids or the dipeptide and tripeptide that they're absorbing. So you're actually skipping a number of steps there, but it's a right step in the right direction. The problem is you can fool a pepsin digestibility assay. And I like this paper by Latcha many years ago. They process feather meal in different ways, and they really damage the feather meal. They produce a very, very bad feather meal, and it's indicated by lanthionine, which is a cross-link amino acids. It's created when the conditions are bad. The amino acids get destroyed. I'll show you the reaction after, right? Well, in the most destroyed feather meal, the most damaged feather meal, the worst quality feather meal, this is where they got the best pepsin digestibility. Does it make any sense, right? How can a bad quality ingredients have the best digestibility? It's because you're not measuring the individual amino acid, you're measuring the ability of polypeptide, the amount of polypeptide to cross a filter paper. That's it. So you're not measuring the amino acids themselves, you're measuring the loss of mass going to a filter paper. So of course you can fool that assay very easily, right, depending on the condition, right? So if you have a heat damaged protein, that's something I work on, you got these crossing amino acids or disulfide bridge, they're kind of knots within your shoelace. You cut the shoelace, right? You cut this into pieces. You got pieces that are small. They're not available to the animal. They're capped by these things that are damaged, but they will go to a filter paper very, very well. So actually you'll measure them as being degradable. And also the same thing can happen with the digestibility system. These peptides will leach out in water. Say, oh, I'm not losing that much. Well, actually, right, you're going to be losing that. So you can fool real, even in vivo digestibility with this kind of reaction. So we need something better. Now, one quick solution to that, or at least one part solution, is to use dilute peptin assay. You use different concentration of pepsin. You start with a standard concentration, let's say 0.2, 0.1 or whatever, and you decrease it. You go to a logarithmic scale of decrease in concentration, right? So each ingredient will have a slightly different dynamic, but I look at this paper here. I like this paper by Parsons, very old paper, but you say, well, which meat and bone meal is the best, right? How can I associate like which one is the better meat and bone meal on basis of this test? It's very difficult to study, but if you simply plot the results, then it's become, in my opinion, pretty apparent, right? With high pepsin concentration, everything is digestible, everything is degradable, there's enough power to hydrolyze. Then you drop the concentration, and then you start to see difference. And you drop it further, and then you really see that difference. You don't know which concentration, right, you should be targeting, so that's why I'm suggesting using several concentration and screening, because each ingredient will have its own type of ingredients, will have its own type of dynamic. But by using 2, 3, 4 concentration of pepsin, you can really identify. So say, well, the top one here, right, it's probably high quality ingredients, so I increase more enzyme, the protein is becoming more digestible, right? The other one, I decrease the enzyme, and then there's a point, well, like the digestibility gets bogged down. It's really starting to affect. There's something chemically in there that is interfering with the digestion process. So this, I would be worried about these ingredients. So simple kind of quality control test, right? Changing your digestibility, your degraded pepsin digestibility assay by having different concentration. Plotting the results may actually be very informative about at least screening, identifying problem ingredient. This ingredient, we should be careful about it. This one seems to be fine. So extremely simple approach. Now the other approach that is more rational is why not focus on not just the mass of like stuff go to a filter paper, but measure the hydrolysis of bonds between amino acid. And that's what the pH stat assay is doing. And Dr. Rachani Puk, right, is working for DSM, is working on this. So she shared a number of slides with me, and I also work on this and collaborate with Suregain, a company, a Canadian company, many years ago on this. I'll summarize a little bit or finding. So now, I collaborated in the 1990s with Adel Mwafi, who works for Cargill. EWAS now is on a salmon oil, and he was with a company called Suregain before that was bought by Nutrico. And we work on combining my results from in vivo digestibility with results from in vitro digestibility pH stat assay. And Adele was a very strong believer in this technique because actually the trial that we did worked out fantastic. This is the degradability of the protein using the pH stat method, and we correlated with the digestibility measurements that I did in the lab. And it was amazing, the results lined up on the same thing, right? We had fish meal, we had poultry byproduct meal, we had meat and bone meal. They all line up on the same line. We could actually predict the digestibility of these ingredients that are really different using a pH stat assay. Blood meal had a different digestion dynamic, so it was kind of lower degradability, but we could also contrast the quality of different blood meal using this. It was actually, so lower degradability, higher digestibility in blood meal that we're measuring, and we could also fit a function for blood meal. So you need to have specific ingredients. So we're really quite encouraged. And what is great with the pH stat assay is you're not just looking at that disappearance of mass through a filter paper. You're really focusing on the enzyme hydrolyzing bonds between amino acids, and you titrate, right? It creates basic conditions, and you titrate it using acid. So Dr. Rachani optimize the technique, look at different technique, you like different enzyme mix and different ways of doing it, and really invest many months and years doing this, and they've optimized the technique at DSM in order to screen the quality of different ingredients, and she's getting extremely interesting result. So it involves extracting enzymes, reacting this, titrating this. So you need that titrator. That little thing is a pretty machine, costs about $25,000 to $50,000, $70,000 depending on the level of how bells and whistles you get. It's not cheap, but it's a very useful piece of technology if you can develop the technique. But you need to invest the time to develop the technique. It's not something you just pick up a book, you copy, and this. It needs a lot of development and validation work. So you really need to invest many months to validate this. But once you have the technique worked out, then it becomes very beautiful because you can look at different ingredients, but you can also look at the potential of different solutions. Of course, Rachani works for DSM, so she's interested in selling protease, right? So they're looking at the effect of protease and demonstrated that the use of their protease could improve the digestibility by 20-24%, right? Depending on the type of ingredients. So then you're able to do this. So beautiful technique like this. And again, you're not just looking at the disappearance of stuff to a filter paper, you're really at the chemical level. You're looking at the hydrolysis of bonds, so it's a lot more finer, more credible assessment of the digestibility of the ingredients. So that's as close as you can get to measuring real digestibility and protein utilization in the animal. All right, now say, well, if we look into the process, the chemical reaction, right? We're looking at measuring these chemical reaction. When we look at the pH change, why not measure the chemical reaction themselves, right? If we know a certain types of chemical reaction is affecting the digestibility, well, I can go around and define ways to estimate it, or I can go directly and say, well, if I'm concerned about heat damage, well, let's measure heat damage, the chemical change associated with heat damage. Well, right, we know heat damage will damage amino acids and make them less available to the animal, less digestible and less available. You can do the experiments, you can take soybean meal, put in an autoclave for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, and the digestibility is going to drop like a stone, right? Heat will induce chemical change. Some of these changes are beneficial. Some of these changes are negative, and it's a matter of finding the right balance. But what are those changes? And that's something I'm saying my lab is the only one of the only one working on it, at least from a feed manufacturing or feed ingredient perspective. There's a lot of it in the food science side, but very little on the feed manufacturing and things. because it's extremely complicated. There's many different kinds of reaction. And if you want my opinion, a lot of people are talking sometimes about heat damage, and they're just looking at one reaction and say, oh, this is responsible, like Maillard reaction. You read papers, Maillard reaction is responsible. Well, Maillard reaction is one of the reactions associated with heat damage, but in my opinion, is the reaction that you can see. The ingredient is browning, is becoming the color of caramel, but it's not very important. It's not the main determinant of the digestibility of the ingredient. It's only an indicator of heat damage, but it's not a major determinant of heat damage. And I can explain my thinking if you want. The two main reaction, right, involves protein linkage or amino acid cross-linkage. Cross-link amino acids and disulfide bonds. And I've shown this schematic, and I scared a lot of people before with this schematic, but basically when you submit a sample of protein to heat, especially under high pH alkaline condition, and when you have lots of transition metal like blood and metals in it, right? Feed manufacturing involves lots of metals, vessels, and the like, and mixture of ingredients of different things. When you have lots of soluble protein, lots of serine, that serine converts into dehydroalanine. Cysteine degrades into dehydroalanine, and dehydro is a super glue. It's like the gorilla glue. I don't know here in Thailand what you have. In Canada, it's crazy glue or gorilla glue, right? It binds to everything. It likes iodine, it likes histidine, it likes lysine, it likes cysteine, etc. And it creates those not in isolation, but within protein. So create knots within the protein and makes the part of the protein more difficult to digest. They're really knots within a shoelace, and they're impossible to undo. You have to cut around them in order to get to the amino acid. So this, right? Well, we look at the formation of this. I had a PhD student who do this. She took chicken breast, she freeze dry it, white chicken breast, because animal protein, low fat, right? Easy to freeze dry and grind to powder. And she exposed the powder to different conditions. She measured amino acids and cross-link amino acids using UPLC, the same that we use for amino acid, using the AQUATAG technique. And she found that above 115 degrees C, the creation, especially under dirty condition when there's transition metal or blood or some type of soluble protein, then or oxidized lipids, then the formation of these cross-link, of these knots within the shoelace, within the protein structure, increased dramatically, right? We're extruding feed at 125 to 150 C, right? So that we're in the territory, the dangerous territory. So actually I got sample, Temasek University, Polytechnic University has carried out the trial, and we're analyzing the sample right now. And they found that with certain type of ingredient, extrusion temperature has an impact on digestibility. So we're looking whether they created the cross-link amino acids. So hopefully within a few months I'll be able to answer that question, whether extrusion can contribute to that. The temperature we use in extrusion can contribute to that formation. So something important, right? So rather than measuring pepsin digestibility or even pH stat, I believe that measuring the end product of that heat damage might be more meaningful. Measuring things like lanthionine or lysinoalanine may be the solution, right, to determining whether something was heat damage or not. The other reaction is disulfide bond. It's also a cross-link reaction. It's a reaction between cysteine and cysteine. This reaction, this linkage between cysteine and cysteine to produce cysteine, the dimer, right, within protein, is behind the strength of hair, of nails, of claws, and everything. That's what makes the protein so solid, insoluble, and also indigestible. So the formation of disulfide bond is something used in nature, in biology, in order to make something very stable and make something completely indigestible. If you have lots of disulfide bond, a protein will be completely. You grind feathers, you feed it to pigs, and my friends did it in the 1990s. You get 0% digestibility. You grind up feathers, 0% digestibility. You break up the disulfide bond and the feather becomes quite highly digestible, 70, 80% digestible. So very important. So my students, Guillaume Ferti, look at the disulfide bond that were present not in feathers, but in feather meal, right? The stuff that has already been processed, in which we're supposed to have destroyed the disulfide bond. And I showed this trial before, and he used enzymes and sodium sulfite to break the disulfide bonds. And to make a long story short, by this process, increase the digestibility by 10 to 12 percentage point. Huge jump in digestibility of feather meal. So feather meal that we already processed to destroy the disulfide bonds, already, right, you further hydrolyze it, you further destroy more disulfide bond, and the digestibility jump. And it's not just digestibility, it's bioavailability of amino acid that jumps, right? The lysine, the arginine that we measure here, the bioavailability jump, and it becomes almost perfectly digestible to the animal. Now, what we found, though, was that actually digestibility was not always a good indicator of bioavailability. Our feather meal 1 had a digestibility of 86%. Our feather meal 2 had a digestibility of 85%. They should have been equal in terms of performance, and the feather meal 2 was much better than feather meal 1. It was made with pure feather. Feather meal 1 was made with pure feather and hog hair mix, right? And therefore maybe more disulfide bond and more cross-linked amino acid. And that's the other thing. It's not just so both disulfide bond and cross-linked amino acids seem to be important for the quality of it. So again, rather than measuring pepsin digestibility or pH stat, why don't you measure cross-link, and why don't you measure disulfide bond? Cross-link amino acid we can measure using HPLC or UPLC, the AQUATAG technique if you have the standard. Measuring disulfide bond is a different story and is very complicated, and it required us to use Raman spectroscopy. So that we use a machine that was worth millions of dollars. We went to the biophysics lab, people that study the structure of protein in the cell of the retina, for example. They're studying like very specific things. They have this equipment to study very specific compound. Well, we actually found that you can actually measure a lot of different things. And the physics professor we're working with, he says, oh, we could do amino acid profile easily with this machine. It's just having the right standard, but we could do your amino acid profile. The problem is it took 12 hours to run one sample, right? So good luck if you're running a feed mill and a sample takes 12 hours to be analyzed per sample, right? You're going to be there next year to finish up your batch of ingredients, so not very useful, and the machine is too expensive. But for research, it's extremely useful and allows you to measure the disulfide bond, the sulfide bond, etc., and the change. And more than this, right? They're basically using this technique. My students, extremely smart students, worked out all the math and the technique to be able to calculate the area under the curve, a very, very small part of the spectrum. And he was able to contrast the effect of his treatment and then characterize. And then what making two things too crazy, but when you have disulfide bond, they come in different things. You got goes, trans goes, whatever, right? There's two molecules that can be oriented different ways. And what he found is that actually the transformation, it's not just about disulfide bond, it's about the type of disulfide bond, the conformation of the disulfide bond. And he found that if he disrupted it with his technique, he still had some disulfide bond, but they were the weaker kind. And he could only measure this using the Raman spectroscopy, right? And the machine is very expensive, but then he went out on the market and he got a patent actually for this. And then he started looking for equipment that would be affordable for feed manufacturer, and he found one for about $80,000 US, a machine that could measure this. So he was promoting the use or the sales of those machines to rendering company and feed company. But still, I don't think that the technology is things. But you see, right, we went from lab relevant study now to studies that are more relevant to the industry. We're getting in a price point where it's relevant for the industry. Now, talking about Raman spectroscopy, this is actually offering very interesting opportunity for characterizing the quality of lipids. Characterizing the quality of lipids, you use GC, you can use TLC, like tin plate things, separate the lipid class, analyze the individual this, right? But it's tedious, it's costly, it costs me about $100, $200 per sample to do this, right? Requires a lot of extraction, lots of chemical, takes a lot of time. What if we could have a quick technique to characterize lipids, the fatty acid composition, the lipid class, the level of oxidation, right? All issues of lipid quality that are difficult. It's also difficult to do, right? Sometimes because you got colors, the oil often get pigmented, right? Because they're extracted from products, so they interfere with colorimetric method that we're often using. So actually, Raman spectroscopy is emerging as a very good tool to measure, right, composition, determine fraud, and determine the degree of oxidation. In the field of lipid, imagine, right, you're buying a certain types of vegetable oil. Well, what tells you that you really got canola oil? You didn't get soybean, or you're getting palm oil, or some type of other kind of oil, right? You have to be able to rapidly screen whether what you ordered is what is, right? The origin, the fatty acid composition will also change, so you need rapid. So actually, equipment is being now, they're kind of 3D equipment. They shine a laser inside even a bottle like this. It triangulates, and it can actually give you an identity or fingerprint, at least maybe not a chemical analysis, but at least a fingerprint. You can look at the makeup of triacylglyceride, cholesterol, phospholipids using this. You can also look at the identity, right? It's very common in olive oil, right? A lot of olive oil is adulterated by other stuff, or they pass a different kind of oil for olive oil, or right, or you buy a very expensive walnut oil or the like. Well, right, there's a lot of fraud out there. By having that machine, you can have a fingerprint and then say, oh, this is really this, or it's consistent with what I'm expecting. So it's very useful, but it's also very useful for measuring oxidation. So there's been used now to be able to monitor the degree of rancidity of oil as it changed. So research is interesting research, and they studied, right, they screened the same oil after 0 days, right, fresh oil, and then they aged the oil for 27 days and more, and then they look at the change in spectra. So by analyzing the chemical change, right, you can measure the oxidation, determine the oxidation. And they found actually very good correlation between the predicted oxidation or rancidity of oil using this kind of machine and the traditional chemical test, peroxide value, anizidine value, oxidative stability, and the like. So actually really interesting technology out there. And what's beautiful is starting to be NL. So you can actually go on the floor and then start, right, scanning a barrel or a bottle or something, or right, the oil directly in the feed mill. So the same way you can do now with NL and near. So the technology is coming, right? It's like Star Trek or Star Wars coming to reality. So really quite exciting development of the technology. Now, one thing I think we're not investing enough time in terms of quality control is with the grain. Actually, right, we use the grain. They play a very important role in the supply of starch to the animal, but really it plays such a central role in feed pellet quality, right? Run these formulation workshops, say, oh, we use wheat flour, oh, we use wheat grain, oh, when we use wheat grain, wheat flour, we get better results than wheat grain or something, right? But there's different grades of wheat grain, there's different grades of wheat flour, and I'm not seeing that degree of refinement in the assessment, right? We say wheat flour is better than wheat grain, but there's different kinds of wheat grain and there's different kinds of wheat flour, so we should be focusing on this, and we don't pay too much attention to this. I spend a lot of time with feed manufacturer reviewing this, and I see a lot of repro. I see feed manufacturer that have 10% repro, 15% repro. They're using this in formulation. That means you got a truckload of repro, right, being generated in your feed mill. Well, that's a problem of feed quality. It may have to do with your equipment, may have to do with your personnel operating the machine, may have to do with the fact that you have to produce crumbles or something, and you're producing lots of byproducts, right, lots of fines. But I'm seeing a lot of problem with this, and it may be related to the quality of the grain that we're selecting. We're not discerning enough about the quality of the grain that we're using. And that reminds me, when I was a PhD student, the very first seminar I saw in my PhD was somebody who came from food science, and they told us about all the different tests that they would do to grain. And it's amazing, right? You're baking cookies, you're baking bread, you're making French pastry. You use a different kinds of flour. You use a different grades of that grain of flour. You go to France, right? You got like 5 kinds of baguette, and they all look and they all taste different, right? And they say, well, how do you produce it? Well, it's the grain, that's the flour that we use, and it's the processing, it's the maturation of the dough, and etc., right? So, I mean, you're playing with the dynamic of the flour, and then for us to say, oh, wheat starch content and gluten content, as if there was any, like the most important thing. The most simple thing that you can do, right, is determine the degree of degradation of the starch. If a grain was in the field, right, and not harvested at the right time, then the starch will start to be hydrolyzed by the endogenous amylase within this. If the grain was stored a little bit too wet or kept for too long, the endogenous amylase will start degrading the starch and make the starch less useful, more hydrolyzed, right, and less able to create that binding property. So the simple test to use this is a simple Fowling number, and it's so simple. Is a tube. You make a slurry of flour, you put a plunger, it mixes it, and then they release the plunger, and it counts the number, the amount of time, the number of seconds it takes the plunger to go to that slurry. That's it. So simple. There's a company called Purton that has a machine. There's several offering out there. It's commonly used in the baking, the bread making industry to screen. And right, I was working with a feed manufacturer in Canada many years ago, and they're saying, we never buy wheat flour or wheat, or we never buy wheat that has a Fowling number below 300. We know that if we buy below 300, we get quality problem, we get extrusion. They had a Knoll extruder, they had problem. They know this, they found this out, and they would never bulge from it. They will never buy a wheat grain below 300 Fowling number. So simple kind of test like this, right? You can see this. In the pasta making, if you use a low Fowling number, so a degraded flour, you produce poor quality noodle, right? The noodle that breaks apart, that kind of are not shaped properly, and they cloudy the water when you cook them. You use a high Fowling number flour or starch or something or grain, you create much better quality spaghetti and the like. So I think we need to invest more time in this in quality control. I don't have the solution, but based on the fact that it's so advanced in the field of milling, right, a field of human food, why don't we go in the field of human food and grab the technique that we need and apply those to our feed manufacturing and see if it makes any difference on our pelleting quality. The final topic I want to talk about is mineral, and it's not my presentation. It's a presentation by Professor Paolo Berzaggi. I went to France. There was the European Animal Science Society meeting in Lyon in August, and I was in the same session as this researcher, and I was blown away by his presentation. Very good presentation on mineral analyses and the challenge. And I'm going to focus on a small part, so he sent me his presentation and share his insight with me. Mineral analysis is a pain in the neck, right? There's different ways of doing it. When you measure calcium, phosphorus, and if you go down to zinc and copper, you need expensive machine. You need like these atomic absorption machine or ICP. You need to hydrolyze your sample. You need to ash and then hydrolyze your sample in order to measure that hydrolyzate, the minerals solubilize in there. And sometimes things don't get solubilized properly, so you get some real problem with this. It's time consuming, it's expensive, and not always reliable. Different technique, right, have different range of quantification. If you're in the ppm more, the percent and ppm range, right, pretty much every technique is going to be, like if you're in a percent range, pretty much every technique is going to give you the answer. But for most mineral, you're in a ppm range, and even lower than this for certain types of metal, certain types of mineral, and you need more advanced technique, right? The more advanced, the more expensive the technique become. And not just that, is the answer that you're getting is not always right. And I learned that in that presentation. Basically, an ORAT, you can calculate an ORAT. And if you have an ORAT, Orwitz ratio of 1, is you're close to reality. You're close to the truth. If you have less than 1, you're actually below the truth. If you're above 1, you're above the truth. You're getting values, but they're likely in excess of what is truly there. So yes, the machine can give you an answer. There's 20 ppm of copper in your feed. Well, actually, right, who tells you there's really 20 ppm of copper? There's not 30 or there's not, right, 10 ppm of copper. So it's very difficult to think. So there's all right. Now it's okay for copper, for calcium, phosphorus, we can get really quite accurate results. But let's say you want to measure salt content, right? You measure it as chloride. You use the Quantab, you use a probe, you use a potential, you go, right, this. Look at the ORAT variation. It can go up to 7, right? So the ratio is going absolutely crazy. So try to measure salt as chloride in your content, and I bet you your results is probably wrong all the time. You're getting a rough idea of how much salt there is, but that number is not really true, and you use a different technique, you'll get a different answer, right? And those are tedious. You need, like, they're wet chemistry analyses. They're not always, right, very affordable and easy to use. So you need rapid technique. Now it's more relevant to ruminant nutrition, right? You want to get terrestrial animal nutrition because they care about calcium, very important. You got high variation in minerals in forage and in different feed resources used in ruminants, so definitely more interesting for ruminant nutrition. But in aquaculture nutrition, it may become more important over the years, right? As we use more resource, as we get this, as we get more precise in our formulation. And what the feed industry is using, especially in Italy under the leadership of Professor Baizaki, is they're actually testing XRF, so X-ray refractometry, whatever it's called, and then they did this with many different kinds of feed resource and validate the result. And how does it work? You shine X-ray on a sample, and then, right, the electron emits energy, and you measure this, and this indicates, right, the level of the different element. You can calculate the different level of element without destroying your sample. It requires that you grind your sample. You have to create these discs, the same way you do when you do bomb calorimetry. Yeah, you need a big press to make a pellet. You make a disc, and then you shine light on that disc, and then you can measure a sample really well. And then they calibrate it. It works really well for calcium. It works really well for phosphorus. So any heavy element. So the heavier the element, the better the X-ray is, because there's more mass, there's more electron or proton. I don't know how it works, but there's actually better result the heavier the element is. So you cannot measure light element like carbon or something like this, but calcium, phosphorus, you're still at the level you can. There's one here for legumes for, in this case, I'm just looking, chloride. Oh, wait, chloride and potassium. You see the chloride was difficult to measure, but they seem to be getting very good result with X-ray for measuring chloride and potassium. Maybe not so important for us in aquaculture, at least from a feed perspective. We don't necessarily balance the electrolyte ratio like poultry and swine do, but it may become important. But definitely for shrimp, right? You're probably buying, your clients are probably buying lots of potassium and chloride and other minerals, right? How do you screen this? How do you offer that bag of mineral contains what you're actually purchasing? That might be interesting technologies for them. So basically his conclusion is this technology is interesting, it seems to be reliable, and, right, is now affordable. I want to show you this here. They were saying that just the animal feed industry in Italy, like the region of the agricultural, like the region near the Alps and near the Austrian border there are lots of animal production, lots of milk production there for cheese, for high-end cheese. They're really focusing on, like, quality. The cheese factory are using it. The plant breeding companies are using it, and they're selling dozens and dozens of XRF unit in that region. In Italy, like just Italy, one region there, not necessarily known as a agricultural powerhouse, right? Things like this. This country here, they're much more powerful than Italy in terms of agricultural production, and this technology is being adopted, so it seems to be relevant or useful for this. So I think there's going to be more and more adoption of this technology in the future. So, in conclusion, quality control is important to make good quality feed of consistent quality, right? Significant limitation exists in the method that we're using, but simple tricks, right? If you know, you understand what you're doing, you can do a certain number of computation and make sure and judge of the quality of information and generate better quality information. And then there's opportunity to explore novel approach and technique. Equipment is becoming more affordable. Of course, it requires some validation, some development, it requires some investment, but I think it will become interesting for the industry. And I think I have a, oops, sorry. I put in online a little survey. If you can scan this QR code, and I would like you to answer a little survey about your practice. What do you think is important in terms of quality control? Which parameters you worry about? What do you think, whether you're well served, you have what you need? What I'm thinking is I'm trying to understand the need of the industry here and see if we cannot do something, offer, for example, analytical services or fill in a need of the industry and help the industry address some of the needs. Since I have a couple minutes more, I added a little bit of material. I collaborated work on pellet quality with poultry feed manufacturer, swine and poultry feed manufacturer, and my colleague worked on modeling in my university, a PhD student. And they've been collecting PDI data from the machines that they use. I think they're using the Ullman data, the pellet stability thing. And they measure the PDI of many batch of feed, and then they identified many factors, and they use machine learning algorithm. They use 12 or 15 different kinds of machine learning algorithm to try to associate different factors with pellet quality. And they found actually very interesting things. They were able to fit quite well reality with the machine learning algorithm. The machine learning can help you, right? They have 70 different kinds of parameters. Which parameter matter? Which parameter interact with the other parameter? So they use all kinds of computation that the human brain cannot do, but the machine can do. And then basically, right, determined that ash content times starch content was important for pellet quality. Of course, right, the conditioning temperature, the CT conditioning temperature was very important. The type of feed that you're making, poultry versus swine, was important. The feeder speed, the conditioning temperature, and the level of wheat in the feed was important. The level of things, the crude protein and the starch content, the dry matter content and the starch content, the level of soybean meal, the amount of water that you add, all kind of these different things, right? And things like, right, other factors were actually a lot less important. So I think that's another kind of technique in the future. You're collecting a lot of data at the feed mill, using technologies to distill down the information and find relationship, maybe another technique that is important in the future. All right? So I thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to any questions if there are any. Now, hopefully we can discuss over lunchtime. ขอบคุณครับ